Hello and welcome to our fourth episode here on Beta Takle. My name is Tsion, and with me I have a guest for our fourth episode. If he could introduce himself really quickly.
My name is Miheret. I serve as a deacon in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the Diocese of Southern California at Virgin Mary Ethiopian Orthodox Cathedral, and I'm honored to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
We're honored to have you here. So, for today's episode, we're going to kind of split it into two to first talk about a feast that is coming up very quickly in this next week, the Feast of John the Baptist, and then transition over to more of the Abinette side of this podcast, where we're actually going to be talking about a group started by some deacons here in America called Serawite Yared. But, of course, before we get into that, can you tell us why do we commemorate this upcoming feast and what is it all about?
So we're at the close of the year, and we're about to enter now the new year, which in the Orthodox Church, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but also in many other Orthodox churches, begins in September, as opposed to the secular civil calendar where we start in January. And the feast, or the saintly commemoration in the Synaxarium that corresponds with the new year, is the feast of Saint John the Baptist. And so in the month of Agumin in the Ethiopian calendar, what's known as in the Greek the Epagomenos, which means the remainder, the 5 remainder days before the year ends. The beginning of that remainder month is when we commemorate the imprisonment of Saint John the Baptist. So actually, this month that we're in is also a Johannine feast, so to speak, in which Herod had John the Baptist imprisoned because he spoke against him taking the wife of his brother, as is narrated in the Gospels. And then, of course, by the time we get to the first day of the first year in Maskaram, we have the general feast of St. John the Baptist, which is in anticipation of the next day, Maskaram Hulet, which is what we call Mitrata Resu, which is when St. John the Baptist was decapitated, his head was cut off for the Lord. And so St. John the Baptist is understood as being commemorated both at the close of the year and at the beginning of the year. And this is emblematic of the role he plays in the New Testament, because he is the close of the prophets, which is a type of the old year, and then he is the beginning of the apostles and the martyrs, which is, of course, a type of the new year. And so, how is he a type of the prophets? He's a type of the prophets because what is the job of a prophet? The prophet speaks about what's going to happen in the future. The prophet speaks about the Messiah. And so St. John the Baptist is, in a sense, the paradigmatic prophet because he is the greatest to speak of Christ in terms of the future tense, right? All of the others, they speak of Christ. Of course, there are many great prophets like Isaiah, whose book is referred to as the fifth gospel, our Likaon call it Derek Hadis. But all of them pale in compared to St. John the Baptist, who said, Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And so because of this, we call him the divine forerunner. He's a forerunner of Christ. So in this sense, he's considered a prophet amongst prophets. And in fact, the book of Malachi prophesies about St. John the Baptist, saying that he's going to send Elijah again to the people of Israel. And Christ himself hints at this prophecy in Malachi when he says that Elijah had come again and the people had not accepted him, with a reference to St. John the Baptist preaching and then subsequently being executed. And so Elijah is this paradigmatic prophet. He's the type of what it means to be a prophet. His life is one in which he exhibits a number of miraculous works. He also exhibits this kind of being a majority of one in the midst of so many people that turned away from the worship of the true God. He's the few that clings to the worship of the God of Israel. So St. John the Baptist exhibits those same qualities, which is why we call him the second Elijah. He's celibate, just like Elijah. He demonstrates a life of sinlessness, by the way. A lot of people are, especially in the Protestant community, incredulous to the doctrine of Mary being sinless. Well, in the Orthodox Church, we teach St. John the Baptist is also sinless and not having any personal sin. So he exhibits this kind of pure life as well. And of course, in a time in which the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of the scribes and the Jewish authorities had turned against the pure and unadulterated worship of God, St. John the Baptist is that kind of majority of one, right? The few that clings to the worship of the God of Israel. On the other hand, we also call him a prophet, an apostle and a martyr, because He's speaking directly of Christ, and in fact, he serves alongside Christ, which is why we give him that title of the Baptist. So he's called John the Forerunner, but he's also called John the Baptist because he also met, Christ in the flesh and baptized him. And in fact, Christ tells him that this baptism will be so that they can, quote, fulfill all righteousness, right? And so, in this sense, he holds this title of being an apostle, and in fact, even greater than an apostle. Because in Matthew 11, Christ says that of all born of woman, none is greater than John the Baptist. So he's actually positioned in a status of purity that's even higher than the apostles, which is why, and it's coincidental that we're in a period in which we're also commemorating the second coming of Christ.
Mm.
When you look at an icon of the second coming of Christ, you have the apostles surrounding Christ, but right at his immediate left and right, there are two people. On one side is his mother, the Theotokos, the mother of God, Saint Mary. On the other hand is Saint John the Baptist. He is actually, since we're going to get into the Abendit a little later on, Cadusiari calls him Arkule Merawi. He calls him the friend of the groom, which is another way of saying the best man. So
Mm.
if Christ is considered to be the bridegroom and the church is considered to be the mystical bride, Saint John is the best man. He's the best friend of Christ. This is how high of a status we afford to him. And of course, his martyrdom. Of course, Saint Stephen is considered technically Kadami Semite. He's the first proto martyr. But Saint John the Baptist is, in a sense, a proto martyr because he did die for his service of Christ, right? For this service, this virtuous ministry of Christ. So he encapsulates a number of roles, and in this sense, he's the bridge by which the old enters the new. And that's why St. John the Baptist himself says, he, that's Christ, must increase, I must decrease. And so you see his ministry actually slowly begin to wane as his disciples began to join Christ's flock. And John is actually very happy to see this because he understands that he has to close, right? And Christ has to kind of open. So he is the ending of the new year and the bridge that leads us into the new. So there's a great mystery surrounding St. John the Baptist. In most iconostases in the Orthodox Church, you'll actually find an icon of St. John the Baptist right next to the main door of the sanctuary. Especially in smaller churches, it's harder to find that in cathedrals. But the church has always had a very deep reverence for St. John the Baptist. And just as we can say that Saint Mary is, we can say an icon or an archetype of what it means to be a woman, right? The model of femininity. Saint John the Baptist is, in a sense, the model of masculinity, what it means to be a man that serves Christ with all his heart, his soul, and his mind.
Well said. May you hear the word of life. Something I wanted to touch up on while you told this story, you said that our church also teaches that John the Baptist was without sin, is what you said, if I'm not mistaken. So when other branches of Christianity hear this, I'm sure, of course, there are many times where Orthodoxy has been called as a heretical faith. But how can this be controversial to other people that believe that Jesus Christ was the only man to ever walk on this world that was free from sin, especially the original sin? How do you think that could be controversial, and what would you say in argument to that?
So with St. John the Baptist, just to specify here, he's free of personal sin, right? So he walked with
Person.
God and did not commit any type of sin in his deed, in deed, in speech, and in thought.
Mm.
And there's a number of people, by the way, that have demonstrated this kind of sinless life. So, for instance, in Luke chapter 1, verse 6, it speaks of Zachariah and Elizabeth, who were the parents of St. John the Baptist, as walking with the Lord, being righteous in his sight, observing all his commands and decrees blamelessly, it actually says, blamelessly. Enoch is the same way. It said Enoch walked with God, and then that's actually the reason why God ends up taking him away. So, the idea, and I don't want to get into the weeds here, but there is a, a metaphysical paradigm for Protestants in which they view humans as being totally depraved, incapable of even wanting good.
Mm.
And so when you come from that background, it's impossible to say that there's such a person that was able to walk this life. And so forget Saint Mary, who is the greatest in all of creation, who does not know any type of sin. We have even others in the scriptures who are pointed as leading a pure life, at least in terms of personal sin.
All right. And now, when we kind of look at the story of his martyrdom in detail, we see that it was the daughter that went to her mother, and she was the one that asked and told her to ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter.
Mhm.
Why did she specifically ask for that when she could have asked for all the riches or all the money or all the fame?
Right. So the scriptures tell us that her mother put her up to the task,
Hmm.
and we're told that she danced in front of Herod, and it said that Herod was exceedingly pleased, and then decided to basically say, "I'll give you whatever you want." The fathers do commentary on this. Saint John Chrysostom, in particular, does my favorite commentary, and he basically hints. Well, hint is I think too weak of a term, but he strongly tells us that it was not just dancing that Salome was doing in front of Herod, and so he cautions this actually as a story of lust, that
Hmm.
both femininity and masculinity are distorted when the demon of lust and the passion of lust get involved. And so, in terms of Salome, who is the daughter of Herodias, her lustful acts led to her basically uh, being drunk on power in a similar way in which Revelation speaks of the whore of Babylon as being drunk on the blood of the martyrs and the blood of the saints. And so she, in a sense, actually becomes a type and a symbol of what the final government and kingdom of the Antichrist would look like. Because St. John the Baptist uses the same attributes to describe Babylon, right, the bride of the Antichrist, to describe Salome. That both of them are drunk on the blood of the martyrs. So Salome is drunk on the blood of who? Of St. John the Baptist, and Babylon is in the same way. And so her femininity, instead of bringing forth life, because that's what femininity does, it brings forth life. Eve brought forth life. St. Mary brings forth life. She brings forth what? Death. And
Hmm.
so what does sin do? Sin disorders everything. That's what sin does. And so you asked me, why did she not, choose to ask for something else? Well, she lacked a purpose. She lacked a direction. She lacked an order. She wasn't able to understand what Christ says, which is that you pursue the kingdom first and then everything else is added. But rather, what did she did? She pursued chaos and death and corruption first. And of course, the rest that followed for her was condemnation. And Herod, the same way, masculinity is about bringing order. It's about bringing about direction and leadership. But what does Herod do? When Herod gets drunk on lust, what does he do? He says, I'll give you half of my kingdom. What kind of king in his right mind would offer a random person half of his kingdom? So he's not thinking with his mind. Forget the heart. He's not even thinking with his mind. We're called as Christians to think with our spiritual heart along with the rational mind. But Herod, we see here, almost like Nebuchadnezzar, gets transformed into an irrational animal, right? And this is what we're seeing again in today's degenerate culture, where both men and women are becoming irrational and animalistic, and they're basically becoming subhuman, right? They're stepping down from the calling, the divine calling God gave them to be men and women of God, to lead and put creation into order. So yeah, lust is a very, very powerful demon, and St. John Chrysostom says this is why we should avoid venues and places where there is such rambunctious and lustful dancing, whether it's concert venues, whether it's clubs, whether it's any place, right, that has this kind of culture, that has this kind of demonic influence, so that we don't become like Salome and Herod.
Absolutely. Well, oh, sounds good. It's all good. And just to wrap up this final portion of this video, what are some things, key takeaways that we can take from this story and from this feast in general?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things we could talk about in terms of the new year, but the goal is for us to be renewed as the year is renewed. Right? We're called to die to our old self, right? To die to the old man, to the old woman, and then to be resurrected as the new man being Christ Jesus. And so, I find personally, the idea of New Year resolutions to be a bit cringe, but I do still believe that we do have to set goals for the year, right? We have to have these kind of objectives and overall um, aspirations for ourselves spiritually. We don't want to spiritually plateau. And so I would venture to put forward St. John the Baptist as a model for the kind of person we want to be entering into the new year. Because the beauty of St. John the Baptist's life, even as the scripture itself tells us, is that he was leading a completely selfless life for the service of Christ. So much so that he would rejoice when he would lose followers, when he would lose reputation, because he knew that that was going to transfer into the increase of Christ's reputation and his follower count. So a lot of us, we think we're serving Christ, but sometimes it can lead into me, me, me. What am I doing? What am I doing? What if Christ wants us to wane, as St. John the Baptist waned and disappeared. That's the question I would pose to a person. Are you willing to sacrifice your name, yourself, what you want, your wills and your desires, so that Christ may increase? And so the goal is, again, to die to ourselves, but not only to die to ourselves, but for Christ to live in us. St. Paul says, "It is not I who live, but Christ in me." So if we're not willing to do what is in the Greek, St. Paul uses his term in Philippians, kenosis, to empty ourselves out and make ourselves nothing so that Christ can be something in our life, then unfortunately we're not living up to the expectation of the Christian. And that is not the good phronem or the good mindset to enter the new year with.
Well said. Now to kind of transition over to our second half of this video. Seems like a weird transition, but it goes well, especially since this entire series is a Abbanet led series. We kind of wanted to talk about a group that was started here in the States called Serawite Yared, and it was actually started by a group of deacons from all over the States, including Deacon Miheret himself. And we kind of just wanted to talk about why, when, and what actually came about for this group to be founded.
Yeah, this is a great question. We had the opportunity to speak about this on this same page in Amharic, and so I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak about it in English for people that might not track with Amharic. Uh, so the goal of Serawite Yared, which, just to translate what that means, it literally means the, shall we say, the legions or the children or the hosts of Saint Yared. And Saint Yared is Saint Jared of Aksum. Saint Yared of Aksum is a very central figure in the Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox Church as the principal hymnographer of the church. Right, he's the one that sets the hymns that we've sang and the melodical system by which we sing the hymns, and the calendar that we have. Right, I'm not going to get into the history of how the calendar was made, but it did pre-exist the Ethiopian church. It existed, even before Christ, the general shape, we can say, the calendar. But the one that divides it up into sub-seasons and seasons and different cycles and the fasts and all that is actually Saint Yared. So it's actually very fitting that we're speaking about him now as we're entering the new year, right? So, for instance, the first season in the new year is called Johannes. And who
Mm.
gave it that title? Qudus Yared. Because the first section of his work, which is called Tigwa, is called Johannes. And he dedicates it to St. John the Baptist. So there is a very, very, inextricable link between St. Yared's contribution to the church and our understanding of how the church progresses chronologically in terms of the seasons. And of course, there's so many other things I could list about what St. Yared has done for the church. I would just say that if Yared was not born, the church would look very different. That's all I can
Mm.
say. And so, what is the goal of Serawite Yared? Us as his successors, us as the generation now that is living in the church, which he contributed so much to, is we want now to make sure that these contributions are made manifest and accessible to the youth in the diaspora, whether it's in America, Canada, Australia, Europe, etc. And specifically, how we want to do that is, firstly, we want to make an emphasis on making sure that we can, as a unified group of youth that are dedicated and on fire for the faith, for us to be able to go to various jurisdictions and dioceses and celebrate feasts together. We're very much limited compared to the 300 million Americans that live in the United States, for example. How many of us are there? Very small. So we have to pack together, right? We have to stay together. And so what does that mean? That means being able to gather together in different cities, right? St. David said, "Behold, how pleasing it is when brethren dwell in unity." So that's one thing that we want to do. And we want to host programs dedicated to promoting awareness about the different works of St. Yared, his contributions to the church, and how that will also help us understand how the church carries out its services. A lot of people are confused about, they step into an Ethiopian church, maybe it's been a while since they've attended, and they don't understand the different things. What's going on? What's Saw Tat? What's Maharit? What's Kani? What's Kadasi? So our goal is to make these things easier for a person to understand, to unpack them. In connection with that, we also want to host a number of online resources, mainly translations. So there's a number of hymns, myriad, thousands of hymns, we can say actually, that Miheret
Mm-hmm.
has composed, which unfortunately are not available in English. And so there are a group of us who, with the little goods that we know, and also in obedience to our scholars, the Likawant, who do know a lot of goods, we want to collaborate, cooperate with them, and produce English translations that can be edifying for the youth. And so this isn't just for people that are going into Abinit. Although Abinit, of course, is an amazing thing, and there's definitely people that are called to that. But it's important to understand that Abinit, as the succession of father to son, teacher to student, impacts the entirety of the church and all the laity, because it's the centralizing structure by which we're able to have one worship. So it's not just for the Likaunt, it's not just for the students, maybe some deacons that are going into Abinit. It's for anyone that wants to understand, like I said, how our worship service operates, right? Because you are not, and now I'm speaking to my layman friends, brothers and sisters. You are not the audience. It's not like when you go into a Protestant church and it's just the audience and the people on the stage perform. All of us are called to participate in the worship of Christ, right? We're all facing the east. We're all facing the altar. We're all called to participate. And so this also puts an obligation on you, the viewer, to also invest time in learning how the service works. And so we want to make that easier on you. We want to make the yoke, as Christ says, light and easy to bear. And so we hope for people to support us in a number of ways. One way you can support is by subscribing to our YouTube page as well, Serawite Yared. Another thing you can also do is follow us on social media, particularly on Instagram. We have a Serawite Yared page, and you can stay tuned for any announcements that we're going to have about programs, whether they're in person, on Zoom, resources that we're going to release, videos even. Recently, I think it was about a month ago, we did an interview with a teacher of Dugwa, a Dugwa Memher, which we had subtitled in English. So you can look out for a number of these things. So that's the general gist of things.
Love to hear it. I must ask, compared to, I think, the very first time that y'all got together, members alike, I believe was in Nashville, Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And then your second here in Dallas, Texas.
Yes.
And I was wondering, for the showcase that y'all put on the day before the feast here in
Mhm.
Dallas, was it? Did y'all also have that same showcase in Tennessee, or was it something that y'all added on? And why did you add that on?
Yes. So our general plan is to have one major showcase program uh, per year. And our goal is to have that happen around the annual feast of Saint Yared. So Saint Yared himself has a feast in the Synaxarium, which takes
Mm,
place on Gunbot Hasrand, which is around May-ish, which is when, if you remember, that's when we were in Dallas. And so that is when we're having what we call in Zikra Yared, or what we call in English the commemoration of Saint Yared. So we'll have multiple get-togethers, whether they're formal or informal. Informal in the sense of being, we're just going to tell people that this is a feast you should go to, and a lot of us are going to be there. Formal in the sense in which we'll have programs planned. So in
mm,
terms of Nashville, what we did is we simply coordinated with the people at that parish to make sure that we had a lengthier matin service, what we call mahirit, and we had a very intentional approach to making sure that the youth could involve themselves in said service, and also the hours were much longer. Particularly in America, because of understaffed parishes, and also simply because we're in the diaspora, the matins can also tend to be a little shorter than they are back in Ethiopia. We're going
right.
to approach the services now on behalf of Saw Tat Yar with more of an intentionality to make sure that it's as authentic as can be, so that a person can walk into that parish that we're going to be celebrating whatever feast it is, and it will be the exact same thing that they would see if they were to take a flight back to Ethiopia. That's the idea. So that's what we did with Nashville. And then with Dallas, we added on the additional English program, and then also did the Matin service as well. And we're planning on organizing something, God willing, in the winter as well, in the same vein.
Sounds fantastic. Now, of course, there are so many good things that came out of Serawite Yared, but I want to talk about, maybe take a couple steps back when y'all were still getting this group together, when you were still trying to put all the ideas in a row with your team. What were some struggles that y'all ran into?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the struggles is knowing where to start, because again, there is so much work to do on this, and I think this is something we're still trying to work on, which is kind of trying to see where we should put our focus on the most. And so uh, this will also, we're going to need people's help with, because we also want the public to communicate to us what in particular they want to see being done. I think right now, maybe this is just from my perspective. Maybe other people in our committee can come and speak on this at another time. But I think it seems that the public right now seems to really want translations. This is what I've seen, not just on Serawite Yared, but also on a number of different Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox pages, is that there's a big thirst right now for translations. And so right now we're in the process of trying to set together a certain subcommittee of people who can volunteer to help out with translations. I know there's a number of gifted young servants, both men and women in the church, who uh, either have a great knowledge of Ge'ez or have a great knowledge of English, or both, all of the above. And so our goal is to eventually translate almost all the major works that are often used, at least in the diaspora, in English, and have them in one centralized folder that people can access.
Love to hear it. And then finally, to kind of talk about translations, because I mean, that is such a big topic, especially when it comes to translating mezmors or translating the Bible or whatever it may be. What would you say to people that maybe have the idea of, oh, like all these translations, all of these, like, whether they're English hymns or the English sermons, whatever it may be, that would take away from, I guess, maybe the authenticity of the church? What would you kind of say to maybe counter that point of view?
I would challenge what they mean by authenticity, because what
Mhm.
does it mean to be authentic? Does it mean that people not understanding what's being sung is authentic? We don't have any intention of changing how things are done in terms of the worship service itself. But we do want to make sure people understand what they're singing, because the whole purpose of worship is for us to understand what we're offering to Christ. So it is a shame for a person to go to the service and not understand the beautiful and poetic words of our fathers. That, I think, is actually quite inauthentic. In fact, in Ethiopia, until very recently, anyone that went through some kind of instruction before entering school had to learn how to read Ge'ez. That was both not just for people that entered Abinit, but just for anyone. If you ask your grandma and your grandpa, they went through this. They went through the Malikta Yohannes. They went through what's called Nibab Beit. They learned how to read, and if not, understand. So our goal is to bring back access, and if anything, to expand on access, because we want people of every nation, of every tribe, of every tongue to be able to worship the one God, as St. John saw in Revelation. And this does not mean innovation. In fact, we don't believe in innovation. We're Orthodox, so we want to conserve what our fathers gave to us. This is the whole idea of Abin. So you're not going to see us doing anything funny with the actual service. But it does no harm if we were to release PowerPoints or pamphlets or booklets that people could use to follow along and see what they're actually singing.
Well said. Well, with this being said, we close our episode 4 of this series. Thank you, Deacon Miheret, for joining me, for talking about all things upcoming this feast, and of course about this new, or I guess not really new anymore, group started by the deacons here in the American diaspora. Follow them, you said, on YouTube and Instagram,
Yes.
Serawite Yared. And with that being said, we'll close off. Thank you again for joining me, and thank you all for watching.